My name is Luna Fadiha. I'm 34 years old. My mom said, "Your sister needs you to take the blame." Then I revealed I was a judge the night my family chose my sister. The first thing my mother said that night was that my sister needed me. She did not ask how I was feeling or explain why she had called me there. She simply looked into my eyes and told me that I had to save her. For several seconds, I stood completely still beside the kitchen doorway. Rain was falling outside, while my parents watched me without saying anything. I immediately knew that something terrible had happened to my younger sister, but I had no idea that they were preparing to destroy my future. My mother finally told me that Lauren had been driving the night before. She said that Lauren had hit someone while leaving a restaurant nearby. Then she admitted that Lauren had panicked and driven away from the scene. I stared at my mother because I could not believe what I heard. Someone had been injured, and my sister had simply left without calling. Instead of contacting the police, my parents had started planning a different solution. They wanted me to claim that I had been driving that night. They believed the police would accept the story because the vehicle was registered. My name was still connected to the SUV that Lauren had been driving. My mother said that Lauren could lose everything if the truth came out. She said that I was stronger and could survive whatever happened afterward. But I knew exactly what taking the blame would actually mean for me. It could destroy my career and place my entire future in danger. I looked at my father and asked whether he supported my mother's plan. He lowered his eyes and refused to give me a direct answer. That silence told me everything that I needed to know that night. My own father was willing to let me carry his daughter's crime. My mother reached toward me and begged me not to abandon Lauren. I told her that refusing to lie was not the same as abandoning her. Then my phone suddenly rang, and I saw Lauren's name on the screen. I answered because I needed to hear the truth directly from my sister. Lauren was crying and admitted that she had been drinking before driving. She also admitted that she had panicked after the collision happened. I asked why she had not called the police immediately after the accident. She said that she was terrified of losing her job and future. Then she admitted that our mother had already discussed blaming me. I asked whether she agreed with that plan. She remained silent. Her silence hurt more than anything she could have said to me. For years, my family had expected me to solve every problem for Lauren. They always told me that I was stronger and could handle everything. But that night, I finally understood what their words actually meant. They believed my life was less important than protecting my sister. I told Lauren that she needed to face the consequences herself. She begged me again, but I refused to change my decision. After the call ended, I sat alone inside my car during the storm. I watched the rain cover the windshield while my thoughts raced. I had spent years believing my family simply misunderstood me. Now I realized that they had never truly understood me at all. They had mistaken my patience for weakness and my silence for fear. They had no idea what I had spent years learning and preparing. They also had no idea what my profession really meant in this situation. The next morning, my mother sent me another message before sunrise. She warned me that the police had already discovered important evidence. A few minutes later, my attorney called and told me something shocking. The police had recovered a dark blue jacket from the SUV. My name was stitched inside the jacket in plain, visible letters. For a moment, I wondered whether my family had planned everything. Then I remembered that Lauren had borrowed my jacket 2 days earlier. That single detail suddenly made the situation much more complicated. My attorney told me that I needed to preserve every message. He also told me to document every conversation and every piece of evidence. I followed his instructions and created a new folder on my phone. I named the folder Lauren and saved my mother's messages inside it. Then I wrote down the exact time and details of every conversation. I knew that something about the story was not making sense. The vehicle had been moved after the collision, and someone was hiding that. My father had admitted that he was trying to protect Lauren, but he refused to explain what he had actually done that night. Then the police contacted me and asked me to come for questioning. I agreed because I knew that the truth would eventually come out. At the station, Detective Harris showed me several photographs. One photograph showed Lauren's SUV behind an abandoned warehouse. Another photograph showed a man moving something toward the vehicle. I recognized the boots the man was wearing from my father's company. Then Detective Harris showed me another photograph that changed everything. My father was standing beside Marcus outside the warehouse that night. The timestamp showed that it happened shortly after the collision. I stared at the photograph and realized my father had lied to me. But the detective said there was still another problem. A phone had been recovered from inside the SUV that night. The phone contained my number and showed an unanswered call to me. The call had happened only minutes after the accident. I had no idea why someone connected to the crash had called me. Then an unknown woman contacted me and warned me about my family. She said that Lauren had not been driving that night by accident. Before I could ask who she was, the call suddenly ended. A photograph arrived moments later, showing Lauren beside the SUV. My father was standing next to her in the same photograph. Something in his hand appeared to be a small black phone. I stared at the image and realized there was much more happening. The hit and run might only be one part of a much larger secret. My family had been hiding something from me for a very long time. And now someone was trying to make sure I never discovered it. But they had made one serious mistake when they chose me. They believed I was still the quiet daughter who always obeyed them. They did not know that I was a judge with years of legal experience. They did not know that I could recognize evidence and hidden patterns. Most importantly, they did not know that I had started building a case. I looked at the evidence again and finally understood the situation. They had asked me to take the blame for my sister's crime. Now, I was going to discover exactly why they needed me to do it. The evidence they didn't know I had. The morning after my family decided I should take the blame, I sat in my living room staring at the dark blue jacket beside the door. My name was stitched inside that jacket, and suddenly my own name felt like evidence against me. I picked up my phone and called Daniel, the attorney who had been helping me understand what was happening. I told him about the jacket, the vehicle, and everything my parents had asked me to say. Daniel listened carefully, then told me that I needed to preserve every message and every conversation. He said that the jacket alone could not prove that I had been driving that night. But he warned me that several pieces of circumstantial evidence could still create serious problems. The vehicle was connected to me, and my family could claim that I had access to it. The jacket carried my name, and someone had placed it inside the vehicle after the accident. Daniel told me not to confront my family because they might destroy evidence or change their story. I understood what he meant, so I decided to remain quiet and let them keep talking. At 8:15 that morning, my mother called me, but I refused to answer her call. She called again a few minutes later, and then several messages appeared on my phone. The first message said that the situation was becoming serious, and the second mentioned the police. Then my mother sent another message telling me that I needed to decide what I would say. I took screenshots of every message because I knew those words might become important later. Daniel immediately told me to keep everything and warned me not to delete anything. I followed his instructions, but I still could not understand why my family was so desperate. Then I remembered the way my father had looked at me during our conversation. He had not looked angry, and he had not looked confused, but he had looked terrified. That fear made me wonder whether protecting Lauren was only part of the real story. At 9 in the morning, I drove to the courthouse and entered through the private entrance. The security officer greeted me as Judge Bennett, and I quietly returned the greeting. The elevator doors closed, and for the first time that morning I was completely alone. I looked at my reflection and wondered how my family could believe I was powerless. They still saw me as the quiet daughter who always solved problems for everyone else. They had forgotten that I had spent years learning how evidence could reveal hidden truths. When I reached my chambers, I noticed a plain envelope lying on my desk. There was no return address, and my name had been written across the front. I opened the envelope carefully and found a photograph of Lauren's SUV. The vehicle was parked behind an abandoned warehouse, and a timestamp appeared in the corner. The timestamp showed to 17 in the morning, several hours after the collision. I knew immediately that something was wrong because the police had found the vehicle later. I turned the photograph over and discovered 4 handwritten words on the back. The message told me to ask my father why the vehicle had been there. I immediately called Daniel and told him about the photograph I had just received. He asked me where the photograph came from, but I told him that I did not know. Then Daniel said that he recognized the warehouse shown in the photograph. He explained that the property belonged to my father and his business partners. I felt my stomach tighten because my father had claimed he never moved the SUV. I called him immediately and asked where he had been at 17 that morning. At first he said that he had been home, but his voice changed when I mentioned the warehouse. I asked him directly whether he had moved Lauren's vehicle after the accident. He denied moving it, but then admitted that he had been protecting Lauren. I asked him who had moved the vehicle, if he had not done it himself. After several seconds of silence, he finally mentioned a man named Marcus. Marcus was Lauren's boyfriend, and he also worked for my father's construction company. I remembered that Lauren had called Marcus shortly after the collision that night. Suddenly, the story seemed much larger than the simple accident my mother described. I asked my father why Marcus had taken the vehicle to his warehouse. My father refused to answer, and that refusal told me he was hiding something important. Before ending the call, I warned him that I would eventually discover the truth. At noon, Detective Harris called and asked me to come to the police station. He explained that another piece of evidence had been recovered from inside the SUV. The evidence was a damaged phone, and investigators were still working to identify its owner. The detective told me that the phone contained my number among its saved contacts. Then he said that someone had called me from that phone on the night of the accident. The call had happened only minutes after the collision, and it lasted 7 seconds. I checked my phone records and realized that the mysterious call had never been answered. I asked Detective Harris whether they knew who had made that call to me. He said they were still investigating, but the timing made the call extremely important. I agreed to meet him because I needed to understand what the police already knew. At the station, Detective Harris placed several photographs on the table between us. The first photograph showed Lauren's SUV, and the second showed my dark blue jacket. The third photograph showed a man carrying something toward the vehicle. I studied the image carefully and recognized the work boots that man was wearing. Those boots were common at my father's construction company, and I had seen them before. I told Detective Harris that the man might be Marcus, Lauren's boyfriend. The detective nodded and said that Marcus was already one of their persons of interest. Then he showed me another photograph taken outside the same warehouse. Marcus was standing beside my father, and the timestamp showed to 11 in the morning. My father had told me he was at home, but the photograph proved that he was lying. I looked at Detective Harris and asked why my father had not been arrested. He explained that photographs alone were not enough to establish the entire sequence. They needed evidence showing what happened before and after the vehicle was moved. I understood immediately because the timeline was still missing several important pieces. The detective then showed me another photograph that made my hands go cold. My father was looking directly toward the security camera while standing beside Marcus. It appeared that he knew someone was watching them that night. I asked Detective Harris who owned the security camera that captured the photograph. He told me that the camera belonged to my father's business partner. That meant someone connected to my father had unknowingly recorded part of the truth. When I left the police station, I knew I could no longer treat this as family drama. Someone had deliberately moved the vehicle, hidden evidence, and created a false story. The only question was why they needed me to take responsibility for everything. That evening, I returned home and noticed a black sedan parked across the street. The engine was running, but the driver did not appear to be going anywhere. After several minutes, the driver's door opened and Marcus stepped onto the sidewalk. He walked toward me and said that we needed to talk before things became worse. I told him that I already knew enough and did not want another explanation. Marcus looked toward my house and quietly warned me that I was in danger. I asked him who I needed protection from, and he looked directly at me. He said that my own family was more dangerous than I realized. I asked him what he knew about the night of the accident. Marcus finally admitted that Lauren had been following someone before the collision happened. I asked him who she had been following, and he answered with one name, my father. I could barely speak because the answer changed everything I thought I understood. Marcus told me that Lauren had discovered something about my father before the accident. I asked what she had discovered, but Marcus refused to explain everything there. He only said that money was involved and that my father was moving it. Then Marcus walked back toward his car before I could ask another question. I watched his vehicle disappear down the street and tried to process his warning. My sister had been following our father. My father had moved her vehicle and money was missing. Those facts could not be explained by a simple hit and run anymore. I went inside and found another message from my mother waiting on my phone. She warned me not to ask my father anything about the money. I stared at the message for several seconds because she had answered my question without knowing it. There was money, and my mother knew enough about it to be afraid. I opened my laptop and created a detailed timeline of everything that had happened. The collision happened around 10:30, and the mysterious call came 13 minutes later. My father appeared at the warehouse at 2:11, and the vehicle appeared there minutes later. The police discovered the SUV several hours afterward, with my jacket still inside it. My family then asked me to take the blame before the police identified the real driver. I studied the timeline again and realized one major period was still unexplained. Something had happened between the mysterious phone call and my father's arrival. I needed to know what Lauren had discovered during those missing hours. Then my phone rang, and the number was completely unfamiliar to me. I answered the call and heard a woman's voice whispering that Lauren was not alone that night. I asked who she was, but the woman refused to give me her name. She warned me that my family was hiding something much bigger than the accident. Before I could ask another question, the call suddenly ended without another word. A few seconds later, a photograph arrived on my phone from the same number. The photograph showed Lauren standing beside the SUV earlier that evening. My father was standing next to her, and something small was visible in his hand. I zoomed in and realized that he appeared to be holding a black phone. I stared at the photograph and understood that the story had just changed again. The hit and run might not have been the beginning of the problem at all. It might have been the moment when a much larger secret finally started falling apart. My family believed they could make me accept the blame and protect Lauren forever. They believed my quiet nature meant that I would never challenge their decisions. They believed I would sacrifice myself because that was what I had always done. But they had forgotten one important fact about the daughter they had underestimated. I was not only their daughter, and I was not simply the person they could control. I was Judge Claire Bennett, and I knew how to follow evidence when stories did not match. Now I had a photograph, a hidden phone, a moved vehicle, and a missing timeline. I also had a family that was becoming increasingly desperate to keep me silent. And I knew that desperate people often make mistakes when they believe they are losing control. The only question was what mistake my family would make next. I looked at the photograph one more time and noticed something in the background. Behind my father and Lauren was a second vehicle that I had never seen before. Its license plate was partially visible beneath the warehouse security light. I immediately saved the photograph and called Daniel again. This time I knew I was no longer searching for a way to defend myself. I was searching for the truth that my family had been trying to bury. And whatever I found next would determine whether Lauren was the victim of a terrible mistake, or whether my entire family had been hiding a crime far more serious than a hit and run. The next morning I arrived at the courthouse before anyone else could reach me there. I wanted a quiet hour to study every piece of information that I had collected. The photograph from the warehouse was still open on my computer screen in front of me. I kept looking at the second vehicle because something about it seemed strangely familiar. I enlarged the image until the license plate became almost impossible to read clearly. Only 3 characters were visible, but those 3 characters were enough to start searching. I wrote them down and compared them with every vehicle connected to my family. The search produced several possibilities, but one result immediately caught my attention. The vehicle belonged to a company that my father had recently started using. I leaned back in my chair and realized that my father had never mentioned it. The company was registered under a different name, but the address belonged to him. I called Daniel and explained what I had discovered about the second vehicle. He told me not to contact the company and not to warn my father. Instead, he asked me to find out who had access to the vehicle that night. I agreed because I knew that every small detail could change the entire case. For the next several hours, I reviewed documents that connected my father to that company. The records showed several transfers between accounts that appeared completely ordinary at first. But when I compared the dates, I noticed something that made me stop immediately. Large payments had been made shortly before Lauren discovered whatever secret Marcus had mentioned. Then several payments disappeared from the records within days of the accident. It looked like someone had been moving money quickly before investigators could notice. I printed the documents and placed them inside a folder marked with the current date. I knew that evidence was useful only when its origin could be clearly established. That was one reason I refused to make assumptions based only on what I suspected. I needed facts, and I needed those facts to connect without leaving dangerous gaps. Around 11 that morning, my mother appeared outside my chambers without warning. She looked nervous, and she kept checking the hallway before entering the room. I asked her why she had come to see me at the courthouse. She said that she wanted to talk about Lauren before everything became worse. I told her that she should have thought about that before asking me to lie. My mother sat down and began crying before I could ask another question. She said that she never wanted me to suffer and that she was afraid. I asked what she was afraid of, and she refused to answer directly. Then I asked whether my father had told her about the warehouse. Her expression changed immediately, and I knew that she already knew. I asked what happened at 2 in the morning after the accident. She said that my father had only gone there to help Lauren. I asked why Lauren needed help if she had simply been involved in an accident. My mother said that Lauren had been frightened and confused that night. I told her that fear did not explain why my father had moved the vehicle. She looked down at her hands and finally admitted that something else had happened. She said that Lauren had found documents inside my father's office before the accident. I asked what kind of documents could make her follow him that night. My mother said that Lauren believed my father was hiding money from the family. I asked whether the money belonged to our family or another person. My mother refused to answer, and once again her silence became an answer. I told her that she needed to stop protecting people who were lying to me. She looked at me and said that I did not understand what was at stake. I asked her to explain it, but she said that she could not. Then she stood up and reached for the door before stopping suddenly. She turned around and told me something I never expected to hear. She said that Lauren was not the person who caused the collision. I stared at her because I had assumed Lauren was the driver from the beginning. I asked who had been driving the SUV if it was not Lauren. My mother started crying again and said that she did not know. I asked whether she was sure, and she said that she had only heard pieces. Then she admitted that my father had told her to trust him. I told her that trusting him had already placed all of us in danger. My mother walked out without giving me another answer. I remained in my chair and replayed her words in my mind. If Lauren was not driving, then the entire plan to blame me had another purpose. Someone needed the police to believe that either Lauren or I had been responsible. That meant the real driver was still hidden somewhere. I immediately called Detective Harris and asked for another meeting. He arrived later that afternoon and listened while I explained everything. I told him what my mother had said without adding any assumptions of my own. The detective became serious when I mentioned that Lauren might not have been driving. He told me that investigators had found traces of another person's blood inside the SUV. I asked why that information had not been mentioned earlier. He explained that the laboratory results had only become available that morning. The blood did not belong to Lauren, and it did not belong to me. I felt a strange mixture of relief and fear. Someone else had been inside the vehicle, and that person might have been injured. Detective Harris said that they were trying to identify the blood sample. I asked whether the sample could belong to the person who had been hit. He said that investigators were considering that possibility. But there was another possibility that concerned him even more. The person could have been the driver. I asked what evidence supported that theory. He said that a small amount of blood had been found near the steering wheel. That meant someone had been bleeding while sitting behind the wheel. I asked whether the blood was fresh enough to connect it to the accident. He said that laboratory testing would determine that soon. Then Detective Harris asked me an unexpected question. He asked whether my family had tried to convince me to confess. I told him the truth and explained exactly what my mother had asked. He became quiet and wrote something in his notebook. Then he asked whether I had saved the messages. I told him that I had saved every single one. He said that those messages could become very important evidence. Before leaving, he asked me not to tell my family about the blood. I agreed because I wanted to see what they would do next. That evening, I received another call from Marcus. He told me that he wanted to meet somewhere public because he was afraid. I agreed to meet him at a crowded coffee shop near the courthouse. When Marcus arrived, he looked exhausted and kept checking the entrance. I asked him whether my father knew that he was meeting me. He said that my father believed Marcus was still protecting the family. I asked him what he had been protecting. Marcus took a deep breath and finally told me the truth. He said that Lauren had discovered my father was moving money through fake contracts. The money belonged to several clients who trusted my father with large investments. My father had been using new payments to cover older losses. Lauren had found the documents by accident and confronted him about them. My father told her that she did not understand the business. But Lauren had already copied several documents and sent them to someone. I asked Marcus who had received those documents. He said that he did not know for certain. Then he told me that Lauren had planned to expose everything. I asked why she had not done it. Marcus looked down and said that someone had threatened her. I asked Lauren and I drove directly to the police station without stopping anywhere along the road. Neither of us spoke much because we both understood how serious the evidence had become. The flash drive sat inside my bag, and every few minutes I checked that it was still there. Lauren kept staring through the window, as though she expected someone to follow us. I told her that we needed to stay calm and answer every question honestly. She nodded slowly and said that she was finally ready to tell everything. When we entered the police station, Detective Harris immediately noticed our expressions. He asked whether something had happened, and I told him that we had brought evidence. Lauren placed the metal box on the table and pushed it toward him. The detective opened the box carefully and examined the documents inside. He asked where we had obtained them, and Lauren explained exactly where they came from. Then I handed him the flash drive and told him what it contained. Detective Harris connected the drive to a secure computer and began reviewing the files. The first documents showed financial transfers that connected my father to several hidden companies. The second group contained messages between my father and Marcus about the vehicle. The third group contained photographs from the warehouse on the night of the collision. Then Detective Harris opened one audio recording and listened carefully to the conversation. My father's voice came through the speakers clearly enough that nobody could misunderstand him. He was discussing the vehicle and telling Marcus that everything needed to disappear before morning. Lauren covered her mouth while listening because she had never heard the recording herself. I remained completely still because I knew that this was the moment everything changed. Detective Harris stopped the recording and asked where the original files were stored. Lauren told him that she had copied them before confronting our father. The detective asked whether anyone else knew about the evidence. Lauren said that our father knew she had discovered something, but he did not know everything. Detective Harris immediately called another investigator into the room. Together, they began reviewing the financial records and comparing the dates with the accident. Several transfers occurred only hours before the collision and continued afterward. The pattern suggested that someone had been moving money because they expected an investigation. The detective then opened another file that contained a photograph of Marcus. Marcus was standing inside the warehouse beside several boxes marked with company names. I recognized some of those names because my father had mentioned them before. They were companies that supposedly provided construction materials to his business. But the documents showed that several of those companies were controlled by the same people. Detective Harris said that they might be looking at financial fraud as well. I asked whether that meant the hit and run was connected to the money. He said that they could not confirm that yet, but the evidence suggested a connection. Then he opened another audio file that had been recorded the night of the accident. This recording was shorter, but the first few seconds immediately caught our attention. My father was asking someone whether Lauren had taken the documents. A male voice answered that she had copied them and sent them somewhere. My father then asked whether anyone knew about the transfer. The male voice said that only one person outside the family had received the information. I asked Detective Harris who that person might be. He said they would need to identify the recipient through the digital records. The detective then looked at Lauren and asked why she had followed our father. Lauren explained that she had discovered unusual payments and wanted answers. She said she followed him because she believed he was meeting Marcus. Instead, she found them moving boxes from the warehouse into another vehicle. She became frightened and called Marcus because she wanted someone to help her. Then she drove away from the warehouse and headed toward the restaurant area. She said that someone followed her shortly afterward. I asked who followed her, and she said that she did not know. She remembered seeing headlights behind her for several miles. Then the collision happened, and everything became confused. Lauren admitted that she panicked and drove away because she thought someone was trying to hurt her. But she insisted that she had not been the person driving when the vehicle struck the pedestrian. Detective Harris asked her to explain that statement carefully. Lauren said that she had stopped the SUV shortly before the collision. She had stepped outside because she thought the vehicle behind her was following her. Then another person entered the SUV and drove away before she could react. I stared at her because that detail had never been mentioned before. Detective Harris asked whether she knew who had entered the vehicle. Lauren said that she recognized the voice, but not the face. She remembered hearing the person say that our father wanted the documents. Then the vehicle moved, and she heard the collision moments later. Lauren said that she had been too afraid to approach the vehicle afterward. Instead, she called Marcus and asked him to find her. Marcus arrived and told her that everything had gone wrong. Then our father arrived and ordered Marcus to move the vehicle. I asked Lauren why she had never told me this before. She said that our father threatened to blame me if she spoke. I felt anger rising inside me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I knew that anger would not help us prove what had happened. Detective Harris asked Lauren whether she could identify the person who entered the SUV. She said that she might recognize the voice if she heard it again. The detective promised that investigators would handle the identification process carefully. Then he asked me whether I had any additional evidence. I told him about the photograph of the second vehicle. He compared the license plate with the records and immediately found the owner. The vehicle belonged to a company controlled by my father. That confirmed another connection between the warehouse and the mysterious second vehicle. Detective Harris told us that investigators would obtain a warrant for the company records. He also said that they would review security footage from nearby buildings. Then he asked me an unexpected question about my own involvement. He asked why my family had chosen me as the person to blame. I told him that my name was connected to the SUV registration. I also explained that my jacket had been borrowed by Lauren before the accident. Detective Harris wrote everything down and said that the jacket now looked very different. Instead of being proof against me, it might become proof that someone manipulated the evidence. He asked whether my mother had known about the jacket. I told him that she had seen it before the family meeting. He asked whether she knew Lauren had borrowed it. I said that I did not know. The detective said that investigators would determine that through messages and phone records. Then he told us that the police needed to locate Lauren somewhere safe. I asked whether she was in danger. He said that anyone holding evidence against a powerful person could be in danger. That statement made Lauren look terrified. I told her that she would not be alone anymore. For the first time since the accident, she reached for my hand. We had spent years competing for our parents' approval, but that moment felt different. She was no longer the sister who expected me to rescue her. She was finally standing beside me and accepting responsibility for her choices. Detective Harris arranged protection for Lauren while investigators continued their work. Meanwhile, I called Daniel and explained that the police now had the evidence. He told me that we needed to remain careful because my father might retaliate. I asked whether he thought my father would actually hurt me. Daniel said that he did not know, but desperate people often become unpredictable. That night, I returned home under the impression that everything was finally moving forward. But when I opened my front door, I noticed that something was wrong. The living room had been disturbed, and several drawers were open. Someone had searched through my belongings while I was at the police station. I immediately checked the folder containing copies of the evidence. The folder was still there, but one important document was missing. It was the document showing the company ownership structure. I called Daniel immediately and told him what had happened. He told me not to touch anything and to leave the house. Before I could leave, I noticed something on the floor beside my desk. It was a small piece of paper with only one sentence written across it. Stop looking for answers before you lose someone else. I felt a chill move through my body because I knew exactly what the message meant. Someone had entered my home specifically to intimidate me, but they had also made another mistake by leaving evidence behind. The handwriting looked familiar, and I had seen it many times before. I took a photograph without touching the paper and sent it to Detective Harris. He told me that investigators would compare it with known handwriting samples. Then he asked whether anyone in my family had access to my house. I told him that my parents had a spare key. He asked whether my sister had one too. I said that Lauren had lost hers months earlier. The detective became silent for a moment before asking another question. He asked whether my father had ever visited my house without telling me. I remembered several occasions when he had appeared unexpectedly. I told the detective that he had done that before. Then I remembered something even more important. The night before the accident, my father had visited my house while I was working late. He had asked whether I still kept old documents in my study. At the time, I thought he was simply making conversation. Now I realized he might have been checking where I kept important information. I told Detective Harris about that visit. He said that detail could become extremely important. Then he asked me to check whether anything else was missing. I searched the study carefully and discovered another missing item. It was an old external hard drive that I had used for archived documents. I immediately remembered what was stored there. Years of financial records, family business documents, and old messages were saved on that drive. Someone had not entered my home randomly. They had searched for specific evidence. I called Daniel again and told him about the missing drive. He said that we needed to assume someone knew exactly what they were looking for. I asked what I should do next. He told me to stay somewhere secure and wait for the police. I palleted a small bag and left the house. As I walked toward my car, my phone vibrated again. This time, the message came from an unknown number. It contained a photograph of Lauren standing outside the police station. Underneath the photograph were 5 words that made my blood run cold. You should have stayed out. I immediately called Detective Harris. He told me that Lauren was safe and that the photograph had been taken earlier. But the message proved someone was watching her. That meant the person who had entered my house was not acting alone. I looked at the dark street around me and realized that my family's secret had become dangerous. The case was no longer about whether I would take the blame. It was now about whether my family could survive the truth. And somewhere inside the evidence was the answer to one final question. Who had actually been behind the wheel when the collision happened? The question of who had been behind the wheel stayed in my mind throughout the entire night. I could not sleep because every piece of evidence seemed connected to another hidden secret. By sunrise, Detective Harris had already sent investigators to examine the second vehicle. He also requested additional security footage from businesses surrounding the warehouse that night. Daniel advised me to stay away from my family until investigators completed their work. I agreed because I finally understood that my safety depended on remaining unpredictable. My mother called several times, but I refused to answer any of those calls. Then she left a voicemail saying that she needed to explain everything to me. I listened to the message once, but her words only created more questions. She said that she had made mistakes, but she never mentioned the person driving. She also said that my father had been under pressure for several months. That sounded like another attempt to explain his behavior without telling me the truth. I forwarded the recording to Detective Harris and waited for his response. He called me 20 minutes later and asked whether my mother sounded frightened. I told him that she sounded frightened but also careful with every word. He said that investigators had discovered something interesting about her recent phone records. Several calls had been made between my mother and Marcus before the accident. There were also calls between my mother and an unknown number afterward. The number belonged to a prepaid phone that had been activated only weeks earlier. Detective Harris said that they were trying to identify the person using it. I asked whether that person could be the mysterious caller who contacted me. He said that it was possible, but they needed more evidence before making that connection. Later that morning, I received another message from Lauren. She said that she remembered something important about the night of the collision. She remembered hearing a familiar voice inside the SUV just before the impact. I asked whether she could identify the voice, and she said she believed she could. Then she asked me to meet her with Detective Harris present. We arranged the meeting inside a secure interview room at the police station. Lauren looked nervous when she entered, but she appeared determined to tell everything. Detective Harris explained that she needed to describe only what she actually remembered. Lauren took a deep breath and began explaining what happened after she stopped the SUV. She said that she had stepped outside because she believed another vehicle was following her. While she stood near the roadside, someone approached the driver's side door. She could not see the person's face because the area was poorly lit, but she heard the person speak, and the voice sounded familiar to her. The person said that her father wanted the documents returned immediately. Lauren said she refused and told the person that she had already made copies. Then the person grabbed the documents from her hand and pushed her backward. She fell against the side of the SUV and dropped her phone. The person entered the vehicle and started the engine without saying another word. Lauren said she heard the engine accelerate and then watched the SUV disappear. She believed the person was heading toward the warehouse because that was where my father worked. Then she heard a loud impact several minutes later. Lauren said she immediately called Marcus because she was terrified. Marcus arrived and told her that she needed to leave the area immediately. When my father arrived, he did not ask whether Lauren was injured. Instead, he asked where the documents were and whether anyone had seen her. Lauren said that was the moment she realized her father cared more about the documents. She also realized that the accident could be connected to the information she had discovered. Detective Harris asked whether she could describe the person's voice. Lauren closed her eyes and listened carefully to several recorded voices provided by investigators. When my father's voice played, she immediately shook her head and said no. When Marcus' voice played, she also said no. Then another recording played, and Lauren suddenly became completely still. She said that voice sounded exactly like the person who had entered the SUV. Detective Harris stopped the recording and asked whether she was certain. Lauren said that she was certain enough to testify if necessary. The voice belonged to a man named Raymond Cole, one of my father's business partners. I recognized the name because Raymond had attended several family events over the years. He had always been friendly to me and had often complimented my career. I never imagined that he could be connected to the accident. Detective Harris immediately ordered investigators to locate Raymond. He also requested financial records showing the relationship between Raymond and my father. Within hours, the investigators discovered several suspicious transfers between their companies. The amounts were large enough to suggest that the financial investigation was serious. But there was still one problem that could not be explained. Why had Raymond been driving Lauren's SUV after taking the documents? Detective Harris believed that Raymond might have been trying to retrieve evidence. He may have planned to return the vehicle before anyone noticed the missing documents. But the collision changed his plan and created an unexpected witness. The victim had survived the collision, but investigators had not yet spoken with him. That information suddenly became extremely important to me. If the victim could identify the driver, the entire mystery could finally be resolved. Detective Harris told me that the injured man was still recovering in the hospital. He said that the man's condition had improved enough for investigators to speak with him. I asked whether I could meet him, but Detective Harris advised me against it. He explained that my involvement could influence his memory or created complications later. I understood and agreed to stay away. That afternoon, Detective Harris called with an update that changed everything again. The injured man had remembered something about the vehicle before the collision. He remembered seeing two people arguing beside the SUV shortly before the impact. One of those people was a woman who appeared frightened and injured. The other was a man who quickly entered the driver's seat. The injured man could not identify their faces clearly, but he remembered the man's jacket and the sound of his voice. Detective Harris said the description matched evidence already collected from the warehouse. The driver had been wearing dark clothing and had a noticeable injury on one hand. That explained the blood found near the steering wheel. It also explained why someone had been desperate to remove evidence afterward. The investigators searched Raymond's office and discovered a fresh cut on his hand. He claimed that he had injured himself at work earlier that morning, but security footage showed him wearing gloves before and after the collision. That detail made his explanation much less convincing. When investigators questioned him, Raymond denied ever entering Lauren's vehicle. He also denied knowing anything about the missing documents, but the search of his office produced something unexpected. Investigators found one of the documents Lauren had copied before the accident. The document contained information about hidden financial transfers between several companies. Raymond could no longer claim that he knew nothing about the situation. However, he still refused to explain why my father had been involved. Then the investigators discovered a second problem. Several payments had been made from Raymond's company to an account controlled by my father. Those payments had no legitimate business explanation. The evidence suggested that both men had been working together for years. My father had not simply been protecting Lauren. He had been protecting a financial operation that could destroy his reputation and freedom. That explained why he had been willing to blame his own daughter. It also explained why my mother had been willing to lie for him. But there was still another mystery. Who had arranged for my dark blue jacket to be placed inside the SUV? Detective Harris believed that person had access to my house or my belongings. That possibility made me think about the missing external hard drive. Someone had searched my home because they believed it contained evidence, but they had not found the most important files. I had moved those files months earlier to a secure location. Only two people knew where the backup copies were stored. Daniel knew because he was my attorney. And my father knew because he had once helped me organize the documents. That meant either person could potentially know where the evidence was. But I trusted Daniel completely. So I started wondering whether my father had been watching me for longer than I realized. I reviewed old messages and noticed several strange questions he had asked. He had repeatedly asked about my work schedule and my travel plans. At the time, those questions seemed harmless. Now they looked like attempts to track my movements. Then I found a message from him sent 3 days before the accident. He had asked whether I would be working late on Thursday night. I checked my calendar and realized that Thursday was the night of the collision. My father had known exactly where I would be. He had also known that I would be wearing the dark blue jacket. Suddenly, I remembered something else that had happened that evening. A security guard at my courthouse had seen my father near the building. He had claimed that he was there to bring me documents, but I never received any documents from him that night. I called the courthouse security office and asked whether the cameras still existed. The supervisor said that the footage had been preserved because of another incident. I asked whether my father appeared anywhere in the recording. After several minutes, the supervisor confirmed that he did. My father had entered the building at 7:40 that evening. He remained inside for almost 20 minutes before leaving. The footage showed him carrying a dark blue garment bag. I felt my heart begin to race when I heard that detail. My father had not only known about my jacket, he had been near it shortly before the accident. I immediately told Detective Harris about the footage. He requested a copy and began comparing the timeline with the warehouse recordings. The timestamps created a pattern that was almost impossible to ignore. My father had visited the courthouse, then contacted Raymond, then appeared at the warehouse. Meanwhile, Lauren had discovered the financial documents and followed him. The SUV was later moved, and my jacket appeared inside it. The entire sequence looked carefully planned until the collision interrupted everything. But there was one final piece missing from the timeline. We still needed to know who had arranged the original meeting. That answer came from an email investigators recovered from Raymond's computer. The email had been sent by my father only hours before the accident. Its subject line contained two words that made my entire body go cold. Fix Claire. I stared at the screen because I knew exactly what those words meant. My father had not planned to protect Lauren by sacrificing me. He had planned to use me as the solution to a problem he had created. The question was no longer whether my family had betrayed me. The question was what they had been trying to hide from me. And when Detective Harris opened the next recovered file, we finally saw the answer. The email with the words Fix Claire changed the way I understood everything that had happened. My father had not simply been trying to protect Lauren from the consequences of her actions. He had been planning to make me the person who carried the blame for his own crimes. I stared at the screen while Detective Harris continued reading the recovered messages. The more messages he opened, the clearer the connection between my father and Raymond became. They had been discussing missing money for months before the night of the collision. Several messages showed that Lauren had discovered part of their operation by accident. She had confronted my father, and he had tried to convince her to remain silent. When she refused, Raymond became involved because he feared losing everything. The investigators now believed the collision happened after Lauren attempted to expose them. But there was still one question that nobody could answer. Why had my father chosen me as the perfect person to blame? Detective Harris looked at me and said that he had an idea. My father knew my professional reputation was extremely strong. He also knew that I had never been involved in any criminal investigation. If evidence appeared to connect me with the vehicle, investigators would initially consider it credible. My father also knew that I would hesitate to accuse my own family without proof. That hesitation would give him enough time to destroy the remaining evidence. I realized how carefully he had studied my personality over the years. He knew I avoided unnecessary conflict and always tried to protect my family. He had turned my own patience into a weapon against me. Then Detective Harris showed me another message from my mother. The message had been sent to my father shortly before the family meeting. She had written that I would probably accept responsibility if everyone pressured me together. My hands began to shake when I read those words. My own mother had calculated how much emotional pressure would be necessary to break me. I closed my eyes and tried to control the anger rising inside me. Detective Harris told me that the investigation was now moving quickly. Search warrants had been approved for my father's office, Raymond's company, and the warehouse. Investigators expected to find additional financial records and communication devices. I asked whether my father knew about the warrants. The detective said that he probably did not know yet. That gave us a narrow window to find evidence before anyone could destroy it. I called Daniel and told him everything that had happened. He advised me to remain completely silent about the investigation. He also reminded me that I needed to protect myself from becoming emotionally involved. I told him that I understood, but there was one thing I still needed to do. I needed to speak with my mother. Daniel warned me that meeting her alone could be dangerous. I agreed to meet her only in a public place with investigators nearby. My mother arrived at the restaurant looking older than she had the day before. She sat across from me and immediately started apologizing. I told her that I did not want another apology without the truth. She looked at me for several seconds and finally admitted that she had lied. She said that my father had told her Lauren would go to prison if I refused. I asked why she believed that was acceptable. She said that my father convinced her that he could protect all of us. I told her that he had not protected anyone. He had used everyone around him to protect himself. My mother began crying and said that she was afraid of losing our family. I told her that our family had already been destroyed by the lies. Then I asked her the question I had been avoiding. I asked whether she knew who had placed my jacket inside the SUV. She looked down and whispered that she had done it. For several seconds, I could not speak. I asked her why she would do something so cruel. She said that my father had given her the jacket earlier that evening. He told her that Lauren had borrowed it and that investigators would eventually find it. My mother believed the jacket would make the story look believable. She said she never imagined that the situation would become this serious. I told her that a person had been injured and that I could have lost my freedom. She cried harder and said she knew she had made a terrible mistake. I asked whether she knew about the financial crimes. She admitted that she knew money was missing, but claimed she did not understand the details. Then she revealed something that made me realize how deep the deception went. My father had used my mother's bank account to move some of the money. She had signed documents without reading them because she trusted him. I asked whether those documents could still exist. She said that copies were kept inside a locked cabinet at home. I immediately contacted Detective Harris and told him about the cabinet. He arranged for investigators to collect the documents legally. My mother agreed to cooperate with the investigation. Before leaving, she reached for my hand and asked whether I hated her. I told her that I did not know what I felt anymore. I said that forgiveness could only come after accountability. She nodded and accepted the answer without arguing. When I returned to my car, Detective Harris called me. He told me that investigators had just entered my father's office. Within minutes, they found several hidden files inside a locked cabinet. Among the files was a list of payments connected to Raymond. There were also records showing that my father had transferred money shortly after the collision. The investigators discovered another important document inside a sealed envelope. It contained a handwritten plan describing how the blame would be placed on me. My name appeared several times throughout the document. The plan mentioned my jacket, my vehicle, my work schedule, and my family relationships. It even described the exact story my mother and Lauren were supposed to tell. I felt sick reading the details because it proved the entire betrayal had been planned. This was no longer a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate attempt to destroy my reputation and take away my freedom. But the investigators still needed to prove who had been driving the vehicle. That answer finally came from the hospital. The injured man had recovered enough to speak with investigators again. He remembered hearing a man shout immediately before the collision. He could not see the man's face, but he remembered one unusual detail. The driver had been wearing a silver ring with a dark stone. Detective Harris compared that description with photographs of the suspects. My father did not wear such a ring. Marcus did not wear such a ring, but Raymond did. Investigators searched photographs from company events and found the same ring repeatedly. The ring was visible in a photograph taken the afternoon before the accident. That photograph became another link connecting Raymond to the vehicle. Then investigators found something even stronger. Security footage from a nearby gas station showed Raymond entering the building shortly after the collision. He was wearing the same dark jacket described by the injured witness. One of his hands appeared to be injured. The timeline matched almost perfectly. Raymond had been near the vehicle, near the warehouse, and near the injured victim. He had also been involved in the financial operation with my father. The evidence was finally becoming impossible to dismiss. But when police went to arrest Raymond, he was gone. His office had been emptied, his phone was turned off, and his home was abandoned. That worried Detective Harris because people usually did not disappear without a reason. He believed Raymond might be trying to leave the state. Investigators immediately began searching for him. Meanwhile, my father called me for the first time since the investigation began. I almost ignored the call, but I answered because I wanted to hear what he would say. He asked where I was, and I refused to tell him. Then he said that everything had gone too far. I asked whether he was talking about the accident or the money. There was silence on the line. That silence confirmed that he knew exactly what I was referring to. I told him that the police had the evidence. He said that I did not understand what would happen if the truth came out. I asked him whether he was threatening me. He said that he was trying to protect me. I told him that protecting me would have meant telling the truth before trying to destroy my life. Then I asked him one final question. I asked whether he had ordered Raymond to drive the SUV. My father did not answer. Instead, he said that I should stop asking questions. Then the call ended. I stared at my phone and realized that his silence was more powerful than any confession. He knew Raymond was connected to the vehicle. He knew the evidence existed. And he knew that the police were getting closer. That evening, Detective Harris called again with an urgent update. Raymond had been located at a small airport outside the city. He was attempting to leave using another person's identification. Investigators intercepted him before he could board the aircraft. When Raymond was questioned, he initially denied everything. But when investigators showed him the financial records, his story began to collapse. He admitted working with my father but claimed he had never intended to hurt anyone. He said that Lauren had taken documents that could expose the entire operation. He admitted entering the SUV but insisted that the collision had been accidental. He also admitted that my father ordered him to move the vehicle afterward. Then investigators asked about my jacket. Raymond said that my father had given it to my mother. He believed the jacket would create a believable connection between me and the SUV. At that moment, the final part of the plan became clear. My family had not simply chosen me because I was convenient. They had chosen me because they believed my reputation would make the false story believable. They never considered that my profession would eventually become the reason their plan failed. They thought I was only their daughter. They never imagined that I had spent years learning how to recognize manipulation, false evidence, and hidden motives. And they certainly did not know what would happen when the truth finally reached my courtroom. The next morning, Detective Harris asked me to come to the courthouse. He told me that the investigation had reached a point where my professional role could no longer remain separate. I walked into my chambers and found Daniel waiting there. He looked at me and said that the evidence was overwhelming. But he also said that the most important moment had not happened yet. I asked him what he meant. He told me that my father had made one final mistake. He had created a document that mentioned me by name. That document could prove his intention to frame me. I asked where it was. Daniel looked toward the courthouse hallway and said that the document was already inside the building. I followed his gaze and saw a police officer carrying an evidence box. Inside that box was the final piece of evidence that would connect my father directly to the plan. I took a deep breath and prepared myself for the next step. For years, my family had believed that I was the daughter they could sacrifice. Now they were about to discover exactly who they had chosen as their target. And when my father walked into that courtroom, he would finally learn the truth about me. The courtroom was almost empty when I walked inside that morning, but everything felt different. I had spent years entering courtrooms as a judge, yet that morning I entered with a secret. My father believed I was still the daughter he could manipulate whenever he needed protection. He had no idea that the person he tried to frame was sitting in judgment over people like him. Daniel stood near the evidence table while Detective Harris spoke quietly with another investigator. The evidence box containing my father's final document was placed carefully on the table. I asked Detective Harris whether the document had been recovered legally and completely. He assured me that investigators had followed every required procedure during the search. That mattered because I knew exactly how easily evidence could be challenged in court. A case could collapse if investigators ignored even one important legal requirement. I looked at the sealed box and wondered how my father could have been so careless. Then Detective Harris explained what the document contained. It was a handwritten outline describing how investigators could be convinced that I was responsible. My name appeared at the center of the plan, surrounded by notes about my schedule. There were instructions about the jacket, the vehicle, and the timing of the accident. There was even a note explaining that my family would pressure me before police questioned me. I read the document twice because I needed to make sure I understood every detail. Then I noticed something that made the evidence even stronger. The handwriting matched several notes recovered from my father's office. The same writing appeared on financial records connected to Raymond. There was no longer a simple disagreement about what had happened. There was a coordinated attempt to manipulate evidence and destroy an innocent person's reputation. Detective Harris told me that my father had been formally questioned that morning. He had refused to answer several questions and requested legal representation. I asked whether he had been told about the recovered document. The detective said that he had. Then he told me something I did not expect. My father had asked whether I was involved in the investigation. I asked what he said when they told him the truth. Detective Harris smiled slightly and said that my father had become silent. He had apparently assumed that I was still trying to stay out of the case. He did not understand why the investigators kept mentioning my professional position. That was the moment I realized my father still had no idea. He still did not know that I was the judge assigned to the preliminary proceedings. For years he had known that I worked in the legal system, but he had never taken the time to understand exactly what my position meant. My family had always treated my career as something boring and distant. They never asked about my cases, my responsibilities, or the people who depended on my decisions. They only cared that I had a respectable job they could mention to other people. That morning, their ignorance became the most important advantage I had. Daniel told me that the prosecutor would handle the criminal case. I would not personally decide the outcome because I had a family connection. However, I could still provide relevant information and testify if properly called. I understood the distinction immediately. My role was not to punish my father. My role was to tell the truth and allow the evidence to speak for itself. That was exactly what my father had underestimated. He thought justice was something he could manipulate through family pressure. He did not realize that evidence could survive even when people lied. Later that afternoon, the prosecutor requested a meeting with me and Detective Harris. The meeting was brief, professional, and focused entirely on the evidence. The prosecutor explained that the case now involved several separate offenses. There was evidence of financial fraud, obstruction, evidence tampering, conspiracy, and attempted false attribution. The hit and run itself was also being investigated based on the injured victim's testimony. The prosecutor asked whether I had any personal knowledge that could clarify the timeline. I provided only facts that I had personally experienced. I explained the family meeting, the request to take the blame, and the messages I received. I described the jacket and the strange calls without adding conclusions. Then I explained the photograph sent by the anonymous caller. The prosecutor asked whether I knew who had sent it. I said that I did not. That answer mattered because I refused to pretend that I knew something I could not prove. The prosecutor thanked me and said that my restraint would help protect the case. That evening, I received a call from Lauren. She asked whether I was ready for what would happen next. I told her that I had been ready since the moment she handed me the metal box. She said that she wanted to testify against our father. I asked whether she understood what that decision would mean. She said that she finally understood that protecting him would only make everything worse. She wanted to tell the truth even if the family never forgave her. I told her that forgiveness was not the purpose of her testimony. The purpose was accountability. She agreed and promised that she would tell everything she remembered. The next morning, my father was brought into the courthouse for the first formal hearing. I stood in the hallway when he entered with his attorney. He looked around the building and then suddenly saw me. For several seconds he simply stared. I could see the confusion on his face before recognition finally appeared. He walked toward me and asked why I was there. I told him that I worked there. He laughed nervously and said that he already knew that. Then I told him something he had never bothered to ask. I told him that I was a sitting judge in that courthouse. His expression changed immediately. He looked at me as though he had just discovered that he never knew his daughter. I did not smile because the moment was not about revenge. It was about truth. My father asked whether I had known about the investigation. I told him that I had known some facts but had never interfered with the investigation. He asked whether I was going to destroy him. I told him that he had done that himself when he decided to frame me. His attorney interrupted and asked him to stop speaking. My father looked at me one final time before entering the courtroom. I watched him disappear through the doors and felt no satisfaction. Instead, I felt sadness. This was the man who had taught me how to work hard. He had also taught me that family loyalty mattered. But now I understood that loyalty without honesty could become another form of destruction. Inside the courtroom, the prosecutor presented the initial evidence to the judge. The financial records were introduced first. Then investigators described the hidden companies and the suspicious transfers. The warehouse photographs followed. Then came the recordings between my father and Raymond. The courtroom became silent when my father's voice played through the speakers. He was clearly discussing the movement of the vehicle. Then the prosecutor presented the handwritten plan. My father's attorney argued that the document could have been written for another purpose. The prosecutor responded by presenting handwriting comparisons and related messages. The evidence began connecting piece by piece. Then Lauren entered the courtroom to give her statement. She looked toward my father before taking her seat. He stared at her with a mixture of anger and disappointment. Lauren began by admitting that she had made terrible choices. She explained how she discovered the financial records and followed our father. She described the person who entered the SUV and the voice she recognized. She explained a collision, the vehicle being moved, and the plan to blame me. Her voice shook when she described the night my mother gave her the jacket. She said that she had watched my mother place it inside the vehicle. Then she admitted that she had remained silent because she was afraid. The courtroom remained completely silent while she spoke. My father never looked at her again. When Lauren finished, the prosecutor called another witness. It was the injured man from the collision. He entered slowly with assistance and sat down carefully. He said that he remembered the vehicle approaching him before the impact. He remembered a man behind the wheel. He also remembered the man's voice. Then investigators played the voice recording from Raymond's phone. The witness said that the voice sounded familiar. He could not identify Raymond with absolute certainty, but his testimony supported the evidence. The prosecutor then presented photographs of Raymond wearing the same ring and jacket. The evidence created a powerful timeline connecting him to the vehicle. Then came the financial evidence linking Raymond to my father. The prosecutor explained that Raymond had attempted to flee after investigators recovered the documents. That fact became another piece of the larger pattern. My father remained silent throughout the hearing, but I could see that he understood the situation was collapsing around him. The prosecutor then presented the final piece of evidence. It was the message my mother had sent confirming that I would probably accept the blame. The prosecutor explained how that message fit into the larger plan. My father's attorney objected repeatedly, but the evidence continued to accumulate. Nothing happened because of one dramatic piece of evidence. Everything happened because dozens of small facts finally pointed in the same direction. That was the lesson my father had forgotten. A lie can survive when people look at each piece separately. But when every piece is placed together, the truth becomes difficult to hide. After the hearing, my father was taken back into custody. Lauren came toward me in the hallway and started crying. She said that she wished she could change everything. I told her that she could not change the past, but she could decide what she did from that moment forward. She asked whether I would ever call her my sister again. I looked at her for a long time before answering. I told her that being sisters did not mean pretending nothing had happened. It meant being honest enough to face what we had done to each other. She nodded and accepted my answer. Then my mother approached us. She looked exhausted and broken. She apologized again, but this time she did not ask me to forgive her. She simply admitted that she had chosen fear over truth. I told her that I understood why she had been afraid, but understanding her fear did not erase what she had done. She said that she was prepared to cooperate fully with investigators. I told her that was the only thing she could do now. As they walked away, I remained in the hallway alone. For years I had believed that winning meant proving my family wrong. But standing there, I realized that I did not want revenge. I wanted my name back. I wanted the truth to exist without anyone needing to defend it. I wanted the injured man to receive justice. I wanted Lauren to accept responsibility. And I wanted my father to understand that his daughter was never powerless. That evening, Daniel called me and said that there was one final development. Raymond had agreed to cooperate with prosecutors. In exchange for consideration, he was prepared to explain exactly how my father created the plan. He also claimed that my father had ordered him to make sure the evidence pointed toward me. That statement could become the strongest evidence of intent. I asked Daniel what would happen next. He said that the case would continue, but the direction was now clear. My father could no longer control the story. The evidence had taken control instead. I ended the call and looked out my apartment window. For the first time in days, I felt the tension beginning to disappear. But then my phone received one final message. It came from an unknown number. The message contained only one sentence. Your father was not the only person who knew about the plan. I stared at the words and felt the old fear return. Because if someone else knew about the plan, then the story was not finished. And somewhere beyond my family, another person was still hiding the truth. The message saying that my father was not the only person who knew about the plan stayed on my phone all night. I showed it to Detective Harris the next morning and asked whether the number could be traced. He told me that investigators were already working on it. Within a few hours, they discovered that the number belonged to a former employee of my father. His name was Stephen Miller, and he had worked with my father for almost 10 years. Stephen had recently resigned from the company without explaining why. Investigators located him at a small apartment outside the city. When Detective Harris questioned him, Stephen admitted that he knew about the plan, but he claimed that he had never agreed to help my father frame me. He said that he discovered the plan after finding documents inside the company office. Screen explained that he had copied several files because he was afraid. He knew my father had been moving money through false contracts. He also knew that Raymond had been involved in hiding the financial records. But the most disturbing thing Stephen discovered was the plan involving me. Stephen said that my father believed I would be easier to blame than Lauren. He knew that I had a clean reputation and no criminal history. He also believed that people would assume I was protecting my sister. Stephen said that he could not live with what his employer planned to do. That was why he anonymously sent me the photograph of the warehouse. He had hoped I would understand that the accident was not what it seemed. He also sent a message warning me to stay out because he feared my father would discover him. I asked Detective Harris why Stephen had waited so long to speak openly. He said that Stephen had been afraid of losing his family and his own safety. I understood that fear better than I wanted to admit. Everyone around my father had been afraid of him. He had built an entire system based on fear, loyalty, and silence. But that system was finally collapsing. Stephen agreed to testify and provide investigators with additional company records. Those records showed that my father had been preparing to move money overseas. The plan had been scheduled for the week after the accident. If the investigation had been delayed, much of the evidence could have disappeared. That explained why my father had been so desperate to create a false story quickly. He needed the family to look united while he moved the money. He needed Lauren to remain silent. He needed my mother to support the story. He needed Marcus to move the vehicle. He needed Raymond to handle the evidence, and most importantly, he needed me to accept the blame. But the person he believed would be easiest to control became the person who exposed everything. The investigation continued for several weeks. During that time, I stayed away from the family home. I focused on my work and allowed the legal process to continue without interference. Lauren cooperated fully with investigators. My mother provided the financial documents she had kept hidden. Marcus admitted what he had done with the vehicle. Stephen provided the missing company records, and Raymond explained the final details of the financial operation. Eventually, the full timeline became clear. Lauren had discovered the financial records. She confronted our father and copied documents. She followed him to the warehouse. Raymond became involved because he wanted to protect the financial operation. The argument continued until Lauren became frightened and left the vehicle. Raymond entered the SUV while trying to recover the documents. He drove away and later struck the pedestrian. Instead of calling for help immediately, he contacted my father. My father ordered him to move the vehicle to the warehouse. Then my mother placed my jacket inside the vehicle. The family planned to create a story that would point toward me. They believed the police would see the jacket, the vehicle connection, and the family relationship. They expected me to accept the blame to protect Lauren. They never expected the financial evidence to survive. They never expected Stephen to speak. They never expected the injured man to remember the driver's voice. And they certainly never expected me to know how evidence had to be examined. Months later, the criminal proceedings reached their final stage. My father faced multiple charges related to fraud, obstruction, and conspiracy. Raymond faced charges connected to the collision and the financial scheme. Marcus cooperated with prosecutors and accepted responsibility for moving the vehicle. My mother was not treated the same way as the others because she fully cooperated. Lauren also accepted responsibility for her role in the cover-up. She admitted that fear had caused her to remain silent. The injured man eventually recovered enough to return home. He still had physical difficulties, but he survived. That mattered more to me than any punishment my father could receive. One afternoon, I visited him in a secure meeting room. I almost changed my mind before entering, but I knew I needed closure. He sat across from me wearing the same expression I remembered from childhood. For a moment, I saw the father who had carried me when I was sick. Then I remembered the document with my name on it. I asked him why he had chosen me. He looked at the table and said that he thought I would understand. I asked what he meant. He said that I had always protected the family. He believed that if someone had to sacrifice themselves, I would do it. I told him that was the cruelest thing he had ever said to me. He said that he never intended for me to go to prison. He claimed that he only wanted the investigation to move away from Lauren. I told him that he had still been willing to destroy my life. He said that he was desperate. I asked whether desperation made it acceptable. He had no answer. Then I asked whether he knew who I was before everything happened. He looked confused. I told him that I was not asking about my name. I was asking whether he ever understood the person I had become. I told him that I had spent years building a career based on truth and responsibility. I had learned that evidence mattered more than emotion. I had learned that powerful people could be wrong. I had learned that family loyalty could never replace justice. And most importantly, I had learned that silence could protect the wrong person. My father finally looked at me. He said that he was proud of me. I told him that I wished he had remembered that before trying to frame me. He lowered his head and started crying. For the first time, I saw him without the power I had always associated with him. He was not the powerful father who controlled everyone. He was simply a man facing the consequences of his choices. I stood up and prepared to leave. Before I reached the door, he asked whether I would ever forgive him. I paused for several seconds. Then I told him that forgiveness was not something I could promise. But I also told him that I would not spend the rest of my life carrying hatred. I had already lost enough because of his choices. I did not want to lose my future by allowing anger to control it. I walked out of the room without looking back. Outside, Daniel was waiting for me. He asked whether I felt better. I told him that I did not feel better exactly. I felt finished. There was a difference. The case eventually ended with convictions and financial recovery proceedings. The money that could be recovered was returned to the people who had been affected. The companies connected to my father were dissolved or placed under new management. Raymond received his sentence after cooperating with investigators. Marcus completed his legal obligations and left the construction business. My mother moved away and began rebuilding her life. Lauren stayed in the city and started working to repair the damage she had caused. Our relationship did not return to what it had been before. But slowly, over time, we began speaking again. There were no promises that everything would become normal. There was only honesty. And for the first time, honesty was enough. One evening, Lauren came to my apartment carrying a small box. She placed it on the table and said that she wanted me to have it. Inside was the dark blue jacket, the same jacket my family had used as evidence against me. I picked it up and looked at my name stitched inside. For months that name had felt like a threat. Now it felt different. It reminded me that evidence could be manipulated, but truth could still survive. Lauren apologized again. I told her that I accepted her apology, but I also told her that rebuilding trust would take time. She nodded and said she understood. Then she asked me something that surprised me. She asked whether I had ever been afraid. I told her yes. I had been afraid when my mother asked me to take the blame. I had been afraid when someone searched my house. I had been afraid when I realized my father had planned everything. But fear had never meant weakness. Sometimes fear simply meant that something mattered. Lauren smiled subtly and said that she finally understood that. After she left, I placed the jacket inside a box. I did not throw it away. I did not need to. It was no longer evidence against me. It was evidence of how far I had come. Months later, I returned to my courtroom. The room was full, the lights were bright, and everything felt familiar again. I sat behind the bench and looked at the people waiting for their cases. Nobody in that room knew what my family had tried to do. Nobody needed to know. My private pain did not need to become a public identity. I had survived it, learned from it, and moved forward. That was enough. Before the first case began, I looked at my reflection in the glass. I remembered the night my mother had looked into my eyes and told me that my sister needed me. I remembered believing that I had no choice. Now I understood that I had always had a choice. I could choose silence. I could choose fear. I could choose revenge. Or I could choose truth. I chose truth. That choice had cost me a family as I once knew it. But it had given me something more important. It had given me my own life back. My family had believed that they could turn me into the perfect scapegoat. They thought my kindness made me weak. They thought my loyalty made me controllable. They thought my silence meant I knew nothing. And they never bothered to ask what I had become. They never knew that I was a judge. They never knew that I understood evidence. They never knew that I would follow the truth wherever it led. And they never imagined that the daughter they tried to sacrifice would be the person who helped expose everything. In the end, I did not defeat my family by shouting louder than them. I did not destroy them with revenge. I simply refused to lie. The truth did the rest. That was the lesson I carried with me every day afterward. People can manipulate stories. They can hide documents. They can move vehicles. They can pressure witnesses. Asterisk, they can even convince the people they love to betray someone innocent. But eventually, facts begin to connect. And when enough facts point in the same direction, the truth becomes impossible to bury. My name had once been placed inside the dark blue jacket as part of a lie. But my name was never the evidence against me. It was the evidence that I had survived. And that was the one thing my family never saw coming.